If you enjoyed this episode of Spotlight On, please share us with a friend and leave a review or star rating on your podcast platform of choice. Thanks. Hello and welcome to Spotlight On, the podcast featuring musicians, writers, innovators, and ideas shaping media, entertainment, and culture. I'm your host, Lawrence Purrier. What can be scarier than Halloween ghouls? How about a trip through the LSD underground? Today the spotlight shines on Erik Davis, and this trip is no bummer. Erik is an author, award-winning journalist, and teacher based in San Francisco. He's the author most recently of Blotter, the Untold Story of an Acid Medium, a study of LSD blotter art, and that's what he's joined us to talk about today. Erik also wrote one of my favorite recent books, Weirdness, Drugs, Esoterica, and Visionary Experience in the 70s. His scholarly and popular essays on music, technoculture, drugs, and spirituality have appeared in scores of books, magazines, and journals. He's also one of the founders of Alembic, a center in Berkeley, California devoted to meditation, movement, and visionary arts and culture. Enjoy our talk about the hysteria surrounding LSD, the cultural significance and risks of the LSD blotter art trade, as well as the intersection between that art and the illicit drug market. And now I bring you Erik Davis. What years were you in New Haven? I'm from Hamden myself, and I lived in New Haven for a while. I'm just curious what years you were there.
1984 to 1988.
Oh, okay. Did you go to shows while you were there? Did you see the Dead while you were there?
I did. I went up to, where did I see them? I probably saw them.
Hartford?
I saw them in Hartford and I saw them in Western Mass. Yeah.
Something tells me we may have been in the same place at the same time more than once.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, it is fun. I love that.
Huh.
I have to tell you, I oftentimes struggle with the long form electronically. I generally like to read the physical book, but I devoured this one. It was just so enveloping. I wasn't expecting to have such strong feelings of nostalgia. It was really, in fact, I'm still sort of living in the emotion of it. I think something that really triggered it for me was you caused me to go Google and look up the DEA's blotter index. And just looking through that, seeing it was like looking through a photo album.
Yeah, it's a remarkable document. Yeah, it's true.
I had this sensation that I'm struggling to articulate, which is this idea that the outlaw and the sheriff are often more alike than not. And I've often had this sense that the DEA are some of the most interesting characters when it comes to information about the drug subcultures. And I wonder, how does that notion strike you? And do you have any thoughts along those lines?
I was really interested to come across that quote, which I use in the book. In fact, I've been using in lectures to make a point, partly because it's a good gag, because you can just read the quote and they talk about how the LSD manufacturing subculture has an unusual mystique and is not like other criminal operations because it's not solely driven by the profit motive, and that there's this sense of a crusade and of a kind of higher values along with the financial motivation. And it reads just like a subculture historian like me, something I would write. And then it's from the DEA from the early 1990s, so not even from the 70s when there was still a lot of mystique around psychedelics in the broad culture. Yeah, and then that strikes me that like somebody in there has to really be paying attention. So that's a point. A second point is that blotter index is one particular document made by a character who focused a lot on blotter and really, tried to study it as intensely as he could and understand where different materials were coming from and to analyze the perf marks to be able to identify continuities. Oh, this was made with the same machine. So you have that kind of forensic obsession that's not dissimilar from the forensic obsession of collectors. So that's kind of an interesting point.
Yeah.
That blotter index is only part of this decades-long sort of DEA study that is reflected in the issues of Microgram, this internal document, which is now most of the issues are available online, at least through the 1990s, through Arrowhead. They were kind of liberated, so to speak. They worked really hard to find as many copies as they could. And required like friendly librarians and unnamed people inside the DEA and Sasha Shulgin and, whatever. So they collected these things, and they're fascinating documents because they're internal documents. They're mostly filled with a lot of chemical analysis and different discussions about how to analyze drugs and compare all sorts of street drugs. But they have this opening section that's just like weird developments in the field that come from the whole nation and sometimes even from the globe, reports of new formulations, new drug delivery devices, new runs. And there's a lot of information about Blotter in that. So that was a really good way to like capture a sort of sense of the evolution of the form. But it really is an interesting fact that they're kind of like the first collectors of this form that is otherwise so ephemeral and designed to be ephemeral, designed to be consumed, that they paradoxically help sustain the kind of memory of this intent, this effervescent, evanescent cultural form. And so in that sense, I do respect the DEA. And in other respects, I don't.
A few things strike me about all that. One is it's a representation or a manifestation of like that bureaucratic earnestness. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it thoroughly, and it's professional. Like, although they distinguish or they acknowledge that sort of ideological aspect of the LSD trade, they really don't make an allowance for it or say, so let's not be as harsh about this as we are with, say, the crack epidemic, which were sort of in parallel. There is limits to the empathy or the understanding you want to have for them in that regard.
I mean, it's almost a little paradoxical. I mean, you're right that they were really going after the LSD trade in the late 80s, early 1990s, when arguably it wasn't really impacting society negatively, particularly. There wasn't a lot of like emergency room disasters and people were jumping out of buildings. I mean, it's just not that there's a lot going on you guys could be paying attention to. There's a lot of like violence around other drug trades, et cetera, et cetera. But I think acid always galled the DEA in a particular way because these are members of not only of their own class, but sometimes people who are better educated than them. It's an upper middle class culture of intellectuals and smarty pants who are motivating it, not an underclass that they can enjoy lording over. So it's a different relationship. It's not like, the crack epidemic, we're going to go into the ghetto, we're going to like control these racialized populations, which is part of what drug prohibition is about all the way through American history and certainly part of the DA. And then you come along, there's these bunch of these like smart ass university kids who could be working for Wall Street or whatever. And they're just like, no, man, you can't get us. And they couldn't get him, and they still can't really get him. And with the exception of Leonard Picard and a couple of other things along the way, most of the high-level families that continue to produce LSD crystal in quantity and in quality remain undisturbed. That is incredibly galling to these guys. And so like Operation Looking Glass, which was an early 90s campaign that really targeted the Grateful Dead scene, because when the Dead became hyper popular in the late 80s and 1990s, they legitimately saw that this was going to involve a kind of resurgence and a return, if you will, to like a more mass psychedelic culture, which is true. And interestingly, it was in parallel with the rise of rave. It's like In the Dark and the kind of mega stadium transformation of the Dead is roughly around the time that rave is starting in England. And then by the early 1990s, there's also a psychedelic renaissance inside electronic dance music. So it's interesting how those things were in concert. And definitely the DA was after that stuff and played a lot of really nasty games, especially because so many low-level dealers ended up doing such serious time because of the way they weighed the materials. One of the things that really motivated me when I was thinking about this whole question of the criminality and the religiosity of the acids underground, which to me is like the most interesting conjunction to make, like when you were talking about the DEA, when they're saying,
sure,
that even though they saw that there was an ideological aspect, well, they should have been softer on them because they could see that these are people trying to make meaning in the world. In essence, you could see it as a kind of religious sensibility, even if it's not a dogmatic thing. It's not just like some loosey-goosey spiritual thing. It's like a collective operation of values and rituals, especially around the Grateful Dead. And in a way, it's like an actual heresy. It's like a criminalized religion.
Yeah.
I saw this incredible interview with this guy named Joel Blazer. He was an acid dealer in the 80s in the dead scene, and he ended up getting popped, and he ended up being in the wrong place at the wrong time in the first prison. And so he ended up going to a supermax prison and really just super arduous zone. And then he's just kind of reflecting on the whole experience. And what was really interesting about it was the way it reflected moral and ethical and religious values, even though he was not a particularly religious person. And he was talking about what inspired him about the dead scene in the first place, the sense of celebration, the sense of love, the sense of light. Those values carried with him into his prison experience. And he talked about really difficult race relations and certain violent episodes where those values carried him through. And then also when he was busted, there's always, they basically torture you to try to get you to turn on the people up the chain. And he didn't turn. And to do that, you have to draw on some serious moral sources. You either have to be so obnoxious and pugnacious and filled with hatred for the enforcement agencies that you're just never going to cooperate. So the decision to do that, I was like, oh my God, you're right. That is actually this kind of higher value.
That's right.
It's the kind of decisions that martyrs make. And in a way, it is a kind of martyrdom. I am going to take on this unjust law, this unjust enforcement agency that's criminalizing this pretty benign substance. I mean, it has complex social ramifications, and I'm no utopian about psychedelics, but it enabled me to see in a deeper way that the underground did function as a kind of heretical religious underground, and that actually helps understand some things. I still think it's better to think about it in religious terms rather than spiritual terms because of the moral dimension of it. That's how I really got to know Mark McLeod, who is the owner and the collector of this extraordinary archive that lies behind my book, Blotter. Since the early 2000s, I was giving talks in like psychedelic conferences back when they were underground. People didn't know and cared about them except if you were a weirdo intellectual who liked these things. And they were really great. It was a wonderful space. And so there was a lot of characters and crazies and poets and nerds. And it was all sorts of characters who were drawn to these things. And I knew him loosely in that situation. We united in the concerted effort that a number of people underwent to prevent a person that I will leave unnamed, although I could name him, who wanted to be part of the psychedelic intelligentsia and who was a well-placed Ivy League professor with very important friends. And Mark McLeod had a particular beef with him because he was a snitch. And when he got heat, even though he was a member of the elite, he caved and he not only ratted on people, but he actually tried to set up people who didn't even deserve what they were getting. And meanwhile, me and a fellow named John Hanna wrote up a very hilarious and sarcastic account of this man trying to besmirch him for our underground. It was not like a piece I ran in the Village Voice. It was something for this sort of psychedelic intelligentsia. So Mark read that, and then we bonded because we had this kind of sense of a shared ethics around something. And that's where we clicked. And ever since then, we were really good friends. You need to trust someone like me to come in and sit with you for months and months, hearing these tales that are proximate to a lot of crime, including people who are still alive. And so you got to be careful about what you say and don't say. My ability to kind of recognize that value and to support and affirm that value is partly how I was able to be in the position to be able to write this kind of book coming from the kind of background I have, which is more elite education, but then being able to have this kind of link that enabled that trust to bring me into the story.
Is Microgram still being published internally at the DEA?
I believe so, yeah.
That's so fascinating.
Yeah.
That's so fascinating.
I think it's still called Microgram. I think the recent examples that I've seen didn't have as much of the street information at the front of the book as it did. And of course, the chemical analyses are much more sophisticated and the color images and everything. Like the earlier ones are really like, they're kind of like zines.
It's so cool.
But yeah, as far as I know, they're still doing it.
When I was looking through the Blotter Index and in parallel kept going back and forth between that and your book, you realize sort of like the national branding of some of the Blotter, right? Like I had no idea about the importance of Goonie birds outside of our scene. And it's just so funny to think about, obviously as a kid, as a teenager, I didn't really think about where it came from. When I was a kid, I think I was maybe in 6th grade. We all got a flyer to take home to our parents. And it was like this hysterical warning about this has been seen on a dangerous drug. It'll make your kid jump off buildings. There may be people hanging around the schools giving this to kids. Like I remember it vividly almost 50 years later as like this hysteria. There's always been that hysteria around this drug. And it reminds me of a lot of other subcultures that have that same weird paranoid interaction with authority. I think of things like UFO subcultures or non-mainstream religions. It's all sort of in that same bucket of like, they're threatening because they're causing people to question consensus reality. As someone who actually studies this, and I'm an armchair philosopher, I wonder, does that resonate for you?
Yeah, I think that's generally one of the more agreed upon readings of why the crackdown on LSD was so significant. It represented the capacity to undermine not just conventional values, but even personality structures. And so much of what maintains a society are inherited values and practices and assumptions about how the world works. And so if you have something that clearly is able to erode, suspend, deconstruct these kinds of assumptions, then that's dangerous from the point of view that society likes to replicate itself, because in a way you're opening up for new forms. I'm not a psychedelic utopian because I think those new forms aren't necessarily better, and sometimes they're worse.
Yeah.
You know, there was a real faith, I think, in the 1960s and into the early 70s, especially really powerful trips, face melting 500 mic breakdowns or 1,000 mic breakdowns or whatever, that those were great because they could just clean you out. They would just take away that old personality and like get you ready for the fresh, new, bright, sunny day of I always think of the sun card in the Rider-Waite deck where you have this naked child on a horse, like blonde hair. And it's just like, that's such like a hippie ideal that like, if we can just get rid of these corroded adult bullshit war machine selves, something natural and pure will emerge, but that's not true. Something else, other possibilities emerge, but they're not necessarily as morally coherent as that. But I think that is part of the hysteria. By the way, we do have an example of one of these hysterical letters in the Blotter book. There were quite a lot of them, and there were different kind of parental agencies. It was kind of like the PMRC stuff, but earlier. And so there were a lot of parental agencies that were whipping up this hysteria, so much so that the DEA itself came out and made a public statement that no, you crazy parents, dealers are not targeting children directly. Like even the DEA kind of had to come out there because everyone was freaking out and it was not helping the situation. But it's interesting now, like, where's that hysteria? It's not, even among non-drug fans today, you don't have that cultural space for the hysteria, I think partly because of veterans and partly because of the success of the psychedelic Renaissance lobby at appealing to not just liberal progressives. But in general, actually, one of the nice things about this book is that I was able to talk a lot about acid and acid culture, but I mostly kind of avoided the larger sociological questions. I did talk about some of the chemists, and I definitely talked about the way that the blotter makers interacted with the people who are making the crystal. I also was like, I'm going to let that go. I'm going to just focus on these physical objects. So there's a nice tangibility to the story, because whether or not it happened in 1976 or 1978, it did happen. And here's what it looks like. And here's what we can say about how these objects emerge. And here's what we know about how the blotter makers worked and what they were working with and how that related to other countercultural crafts and print technologies. And so there was a tangibility and a materiality that gives it a kind of presence and a coherence. And it allows me to largely avoid some of these like larger questions that have just been so beat around. Timothy Leary plays a role, but a very minor one, because he's not making blotter. He might appear on some blotters, he might sign some blotters, and that's part of the story. But the humble blotter then gives you another kind of line in. And in that, I was really inspired by someone who helped edit the book with me, Jesse Jarnow, who wrote the book Heads, which is a wonderful book because it's not a sociological book, but it is a social history of psychedelic culture that emphasizes the smaller players and the scenes rather than the famous story. Oh, here's Timothy Leary, here's Ken Kesey. Like we all know that story now, or most of us know that story now. So I think part of the challenge and the opportunity, especially now as the boomers begin to go into that dark night, is to find other stories, and particularly more social stories of scenes, stories of unknown individuals, stories of collective use, collective practice, which are now going to be incredibly valuable as people try to navigate this new cybernetically inflamed VC-fueled psychedelic renaissance, which is going to be extremely confusing for a lot of people once the simple hype proves not to exactly cover the degrees of challenge and confusion that are inherent in this particular mystery tradition. That these ancestral tales, if you will, have a real role to play in helping us navigate this today.
We'll be back with more Spotlight On and Erik Davis right after this break. Our complete library of episodes is available for free at spotlightonpodcast.com/episodes. There you'll find all of our conversations stretching back to our launch in February of 2020. Check it out. And now, back to Spotlight On. One of the things that I found that I think cloud the work of being a collector or even an interested bystander in the world of the blotter art relates to some of the work in the vanity blotter world. Because it's such a sort of criminal adjacent and underground field that even when fine artists get involved, there's no objective definition of like, it's not a form that's like, it has to be this kind of paper. There's a tradition of vegetable ink or this and that, offset printing, but it's not necessarily this is blotter art, this is not. Like, does it have to be perforated to be blotter art? Like, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's I think that's an example of a simultaneous blessing and a curse. Blotter art as a collectible object, emerges in the late 1990s, turn of 2000. Initially, it's pieces of blotter, many of which were street blotters, but usually undipped, that were signed by psychedelic luminaries, but the images themselves were from the street. And then people started to say, well, let's just print new ones that aren't for the street, that can just be vehicles for signatures or just be collectibles on their own. And that starts to be this form. And in that form, I would say that the perforation is absolutely required, not because it's required to make acid on paper valuable, but just because that is what blotter is. The size of it has varied, the size of the hits, even in the art, this vanity blotter world, the undipped world. But beyond that, there hasn't been quality control. There hasn't been the development of a critical apparatus that's able to distinguish in a rigorous way between valid and invalid forms of the art. So there's been a lot of crap, both in terms of the quality of the images, the quality of the paper, the quality of the printing that have been bought and sold online, because online you don't really necessarily see or feel the paper. So even while there have been individuals and outfits that have maintained very high quality and developed their own sort of criteria for what high quality is, at the same time, there's plenty of room for copycats and for dumb stuff, because there's not the kind of framework that you have even in other kinds of street art, let alone actual gallery art. So in a way, it maintains its underground quality or its informal quality, even as a non-drug delivery device. And there's a great quote from a blotter dealer in the book, a good friend of mine named Matthew Rick, who runs Shakedown Gallery, and he's been selling his stuff for about 25 years. And he's like, that's the thing about blotter, is that on some level, it's essentially contraband. So it's never going to be purely assimilated. Disney is never going to do a blotter edition. Disney might do a skateboard deck, but they're not going to do a blotter edition. So it maintains this kind of outsiderliness that just for historical reasons is bound up with perforations on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
It makes it a kind of shadowy form and will, limit its appeal, but also makes it kind of fun because it's affordable too. That's the other thing, is like a new beautiful blotter edition on really nice paper that's really well hand perf. So it's got, you can start to tell the quality of the perforations. There's a little bit more pleasure in like hand perfs, and there's a kind of tactile quality to these things. They're $20, $30. If they're signed, they're maybe $50, and then they go up from there. But like in general, it's a very affordable medium for collectors. And, that's cool too, that there's a democratic quality to it as an art object.
After spending so much time talking with Mark and interacting with other characters in the world of blotter art, do you have a personal sense of discernment, or do you categorize between legitimate and illegitimate blotter art? Like you mentioned the perforation, like do you judgmental at all?
I don't think I would use those terms like legitimate and illegitimate. It would just be a matter of like, that's well made and that's not well made. Just the same way like you're in a parking lot scene and people are selling t-shirts. And there's some t-shirts that have nice fabric and they're well screened and the images are interesting. Maybe they're appropriated, but they're still well done. And right next door, there's like crappy fabric, crappily printed, same price. And it's not like that's legitimate, that's illegitimate. It's more like this is better, that's not so good. This is more interesting, that's not so interesting. So that's the way I would put it. Like I made a blotter based on the cover of my High Weirdness project because I was like, oh, this will be cool. And I really like it. But the perforation is not quite what I prefer. And so like, oh, wait, actually, I could have gotten this other person to perforate it. Oh, that would have been better. So it is partly taste, but it also has to do with the tactile quality of it. And also how people use the images. It's how do they use that format? And then particularly, are they going to put little images inside the single hits? Like, how are they actually playing? Some people, you can just print an image that's also on a poster or also on a skateboard deck. And it's like, sure, that could be fun. But what's more interesting are the images that are really designed for blotter specifically, and that play with some of the language of street blotter, which includes having repetitive images on single or four-way hits, maybe not through the whole sheet, but through parts of the sheet. So there's some kind of play with repetition and pattern that has to do with the history of the street art. And those are more interesting to me.
Do you have a sense of how Mark would answer that question? Is he a completist, sort of has one of everything, or how does he discern his collection?
I wouldn't put words in his mouth, but he's pretty omnivorous, which doesn't mean he likes everything. He was a former art history guy and he knows art history and he taught sculpture and was an artist himself. So he has a really good taste. He's quite accurate when he pulls out, well, this is really excellent and this is just fun. But because it's sort of a completist operation, he takes a lot of stuff in. I don't think he has every silly Rick and Morty blotter out there because there's a lot of them. He does take in a lot of stuff. The other thing that makes me interested in vanity blotter is, unlike street blotter, which mostly tends not to refer to LSD directly, it might refer to it in kind of a wink, wink way, like there's a lightning bolt and the lightning bolts tend to sort of be symbolically connected to LSD, or there's like kind of wink, wink stuff. And you'll see some Albert Hoffman in street blotters, but for the most part, street blotters don't directly reflect on LSD per se. But when you go into vanity blotter, there's a whole kind of current inside vanity blotter that's actually reflecting on and remembering LSD history. So one example that's in the book is a wonderful portrait of the Orange Sunshine chemist Nick Sand. And it's very clever. It's like him with all this protective plastic gear on because he's making acid, and he's looking at a mirror and it's all kind of mirrored, but it's also a very good portrait of him. Like it captures his personality, his physiognomy. There are other ones, like the famous no-hitter that Doc Ellis pitched against the Padres in 1970. It's this key moment of a black psychedelia. It's an incredible story. There's this wonderful blotter by Ryan Kerrigan that memorializes that. And so then you start to realize that, like, because of its outsideness, because it will never be even like a legitimate street art format, the way that sneakers or rock posters are, that the blotter form can also serve as a kind of memory palace that recalls underground history, sometimes in a nostalgic, goofy way, like yet another dancing bear or another Ken Kesey as a prankster image, but also in more interesting and complex ways as well.
Some uncut sheets of Blotter signed by Doc would have been a great piece for someone's collection. Could you explain to our audience a little bit about why the paper itself is or was criminalized, not just because of its association, but as the medium, it was actually, I guess, illegal?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question because in a way it was up for grabs, like that question. Paraphernalia has a particular status in the law, the way that, a crack pipe or syringes or things that can be used in other ways, but are also clearly part of the taking of a drug. They have a kind of gray market, if you will, quality to them. They're not explicitly scheduled or controlled, and yet they can be essentially illegal because they are so intimately connected. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't give you a history of like how paraphernalia has been, or different kinds of paraphernalia have been treated in the law. That's actually an interesting question that I probably could have done a little bit more work on. But in the case of LSD paper in particular, the most interesting story there that I tell in the book is about Mark McLeod, who has been collecting the stuff and then starts making the stuff for the trade and then gets arrested with a huge amount of blotter that's undipped. They surveyed him for months. They came in, they took everything out of his house, all of his archives, all of this material. And then they mounted a really serious case against him. They wanted him to go away for life. They were he was the kingpin. He's responsible for blah, 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 blah. But all the paper they got from that bust, none of it was dipped. So then they're in the court and they're trying to convict him, and they show like, oh, here's some of his paper that was dipped that we got from dealers across the country. And Mark's lawyer's like, well, yeah, that shows that somebody bought his paper and dipped it. That's all you can say. You can't pin it on him. And so then the question was, well, then why would he have all this paper? And the defense turned on the idea that blotter by itself is art. So the whole question of classifying this stuff as an art object was instrumental in getting Mark McLeod from not going to prison, which he didn't do. And that was also part of what kickstarted the whole vanity blotter world that we were just talking about, because all these other people said, oh, wait, look, we know we have case law that supports the fact that undipped blotter is fine. And it doesn't mean that cops can't pull you in. Like there's like in the early years when people were buying undipped blotter, art blotter, they would come like, make sure, we recommend that you put it behind a frame and don't think that you can just go around and the cops might arrest you anyway. And because it still has this ambiguous status for good reasons, because of course you can still use it. In the old days, all the blotter that was made for the street. Then you have the emergence of a vanity market, and then there's still people who are making blotter editions just for the street. It's designed and printed with the sole intent of being a vehicle for acid in the underground. It's not being sold as a vanity blotter. But if you're too lazy to make your own paper, you're like, well, I can just buy some vanity blotter and dip it. Some vanity blotter is not printed well, so it's actually not good to dip. But the stuff that's good, the higher quality material, the things that are more valuable because there's more care taken in the production of the vanity, that is actually really good for putting drugs on it. So it gets very loopy in an appropriately kind of acidy way in terms of what the status of the stuff is, whether it's illegal, whether it's not illegal, whether there's something untoward about it. And that ambiguity is part of what makes it fun.
I have not encountered blotter in decades. I've seen other delivery vehicles in my time, but I'm curious, is blotter still the predominant street method for people to transact? Do we know that?
That is a good question that I don't know the answer to. I'm not sure if anybody does, because of course, to determine that requires knowing what the delivery devices are out there. And so the DEA might have an idea there. I suspect that it is still significant, but not overwhelmingly dominant. but that's based just on anecdotal sense of things. Certainly, fresh blotter is still being made for the street, unquestionable. Certainly, it's part of the trade. But there has also been a resurgence in the last years in liquid forms, but also in gelatin. People are like, let's make window pane. Let's make orange sunshine barrels. There's almost a kind of like nerdy recirculation of all the different kinds of formats. I don't think people are making tablets, which is, of course, once the dominant form in the 60s. So that's where I would guess, is that it's still significant, but not necessarily dominant at this point.
Erik, thank you. Thank you for all the work over the last several decades. I've loved your work as sort of a manifestation of a lot of the interests I've had since I was a young man. So I appreciate you doing that work for me.
All right. Thank you. No, it's been fun.
Thank you so much, Erik Davis. And as always, thank you for listening to Spotlight On, a production of 23 Media Ventures. Spotlight On is executive produced and hosted by me, Lawrence Purrier. We're produced and marketed by Michael Donaldson. Editing and sound design is by Terry Grant. Our theme music is by Q Burn's Abstract Message. The most important member of our team is you. Thank you for supporting our work. Please rate and review us wherever you listen to podcasts, and then visit us online at spotlightonpodcast.com. There you'll find our free episode archive, our online store, and a link to make a donation to support our work. Thanks for listening, be safe, and stay in touch.